Welcome to episode 20 of Successful Demo. Each episode analyzes theoretical and practical aspects of one more newly released cards. Woo, we've came so far, 20 whole episodes, and the first time I had to whip out this newly colored background. And you know what this means? That's right, it's time for us to assimilate into Apex as we cover our very first mini faction card in the entire series. It's Assimilator, and this is a very interesting card, introducing a whole new mechanic, turning face down cards face up. So what does this imply? Well, Assimilator allows us, most notably, to recover after an apocalypse. After flipping all your breakers and important cards face down, you can recover them using Assimilator if you have one in your hand. This doesn't seem very efficient given that it costs 2 clicks to use it on one card, so let's see what else we can do with it. Assimilator most notably does not constitute an install, or rather its effect does not constitute an install. Turning card face up does not trigger on install effects, which means that you can bypass your limitation of your identity, which prohibits you from installing non-virtual resources. There are many of them that you can think of, but the one that immediately popped to my mind first thing was Aesop's Pawn Shop, because that seems like a very natural fit in Apex, which feeds into its ability, because you get to install cards for free face down using your ID ability, and what better way to take advantage of that than to pawn them immediately after with Aesop's Pawn Shop, gaining you a good 3 credits. This seems like a very good economic backbone for an Apex deck, and is a worthy use of your restricted card slot. Now, Assimilator also allows you to, as mentioned, bypass on-install triggers. This is usually to your detriment. For example, if you install a card like Daily Casts or Liberated Accounts of an Assimilator, well, you don't actually install them, so they don't get the credits that will be placed on them normally when you would otherwise normally install them. However, there are a couple of very niche scenarios where this is actually beneficial, and one of them is Cyber Cypher. It has been officially ruled that Cyber Cypher is not directed at any particular server if it's flipped face up with Assimilator, meaning that a Cyber Cypher flipped with Assimilator can target any server. That is a very powerful breaker to have. Base 4 strength code gate breaker, something Apex could certainly use. Now, here's the deck that I came up with. It basically takes advantage of the Assimilator to cheat in Pawn Shop and to cheat in a Cyber Cypher that can target any server. And then we are just going to play other good cards and with our remaining influence. Now, after I built this deck, I realized that there was someone else who was toying with a very similar idea. You might have seen this Apex list floating around. It's Fed's list that did pretty well at one of their local SCs. So I took a look at it. The core was pretty much the same. Aesop's Pawn Shop and Cyber Cypher abuse with Assimilator, but there were a couple of key differences that I've highlighted with the rectangular outlines, and I'll go through them one by one. This is what I usually do, you know, when I see a similar list. I compare and contrast, and I try to justify to myself whether my decision was better or whether I had something to learn from the list I was looking at. In the case of Spy Camera versus the Turning Wheel, which Fed used in their list, that was a very big oversight by me, and clearly illustrates how little experience I have with deck building with Apex. Turning Wheel is the obvious central pressure tool for Apex because it is virtual, and because it basically costs almost no influence. Whereas I'm forking out 6 entire deck slots and influence for spy cameras which aren't even permanent. They're one use. So even though the trash can on spy camera helps out with Reaver and Wasteland synergy, Turning Wheel is definitely the correct answer, and I immediately swapped the spy cameras for Turning Wheels when I saw the list. That was just a complete oversight on my part. Next up, there was Chopbot. Now, this Chopbot was present in Fed's list but absent in mine. The first reaction I had when I looked at it was, what? Why? You already have Aesop's Pawn Shop, which does the same thing as Chopbot. You won't have enough face down cards to make use of both these cards at the same time. Right? You're either chopping your cards or pawning them to Aesop's, not both. It's kind of like playing Laguna Velasco and Magnum Opus in the same deck. They work off the same trigger, requiring clicks. In this case, they require the same trigger of having installed cards to pawn. So having duplicates, it's not that good. but then I realized setting up Aesop's pawn shop is actually really clunky. You need a 2-card combo, you need to find the Assimilator, and you need to bury the pawn shop. That takes a lot of time, and you won't necessarily get them every game, even with 3 copies of each in your deck. If you include Chopbot in your deck, not only will you get to make use of your face-down cards earlier in the game, because it increases your consistency of finding a Chopbot or an Aesop's early, but also it feeds into itself, because Chopbots and Aesops are not dead. They can be Apex fodder, so you can chop and pawn away any duplicate copies of Aesops and Chopbots you have to quickly cycle through your deck. That is the tipping factor, in my opinion, and justifies running 3 copies of each Chopbot and Aesops to increase consistency. So I really like this idea. It's something that I wouldn't have thought of at first glance, but looking at Fed do it, I can see why it makes a lot of sense. Finally, Fed included a paperclip in their deck, whereas I went with pure AI, doing Omaqua, 3 copies of it, and then a single Cyber Cipher. Well, again, not playing with Apex and Omaqua that much. I am very inexperienced and didn't realize how difficult it was to farm Omaqua counters, especially in a deck without Dean-listed support. A simple purge could potentially lock me out of many servers. Hence, paperclip is worthy inclusion worth the 3 influence. Even though Apex is very influence tight, having a reliable barrier breaker and an efficient one at that is a pretty good tool to have. Not to mention it makes excellent Apex fodder as well. You bury it face down and then you can sell it and still use it because you can install paperclip from the bin after that. So I really like Fed's list. I feel that it is in general superior to mine, and so I took the good points of it, those that I mentioned earlier, and combined them with my list to make this final list, which I will be trying out today. So we are going to go into the game, but before we do so, I want to do a brief rundown on the Apex draw and economy engine for those of you who are not that familiar with Apex and its cards. Apex plays very similarly to Geist, especially when the first non-Data and Destiny card in Reaver came out. But first, we look at Wasteland, which came out in Data and Destiny, which it basically does essentially the same thing as Tech Trader. In fact, ever since Hostage rotated, I've been using Wasteland in my Geist decks, so it's kind of similar. You know, you trash your cards, you gain money while doing so, increasing the click compression you get from trashing cards. Then you have Reaver, which I mentioned earlier, which is basically Geist printed on a card. Of course, these two have differences. In the criminal versions, namely Geist and Tech Trader, the cards need to have trash cans in order to use them. Whereas for Reaver and Wasteland, as long as your cards being trashed are installed, they trigger Wasteland and Reaver. You don't need to have trash cans on them. And this is quite important because this means that they synergize with Aesops and Chopbot in addition to the trash cans. So the Wasteland and Reaver basically have wider coverage, but at a cost. The criminal cards, Geist and Tech Trader, all trigger multiple times in a turn. You get as many triggers of them as trash cans you have. Whereas with Apex, they only specify the first time each turn. This is a problem for Apex because this makes Apex a lot slower. You're getting fewer triggers of Reaver and Wasteland than you otherwise could. Not to mention that trash cans are just not that good in Apex either, bringing Apex further down a notch. Typically, you play those zero-cost cards with trash cans on them, like Street Peddler and Fall Guy, but in Apex's case, you can't install any of those because of your ID ability restriction. So therefore, we expect this Apex deck to work a bit slower, but could be very powerful in the late game. This is something that we'll illustrate soon in the playthrough. How do we go about this? I have no idea. 2 of my 5 cards in my opening hand are Apex cards, and since Apex cards generally suck, I guess that's okay. Especially if one of them is a Reaver, which is probably the one card you want to see in your opening hand, I guess. You have Aesop's as well, but that's kind of dead without Assimilator. I don't know. I've never played Apex much before, so we're just gonna wing it. There are a couple of playable cards from our opening hand, namely Reaver and Deuce's Wild, so I guess that's a good start. Oh, by the way, one interesting thing with Apex is that their cards are generally really cheap. Assimilator definitely bucks that trend, but otherwise, losing a lot of credits in your first few clicks is not a big problem. Now, I find the Assimilator on the draw, so, that changes things. Instead of installing my my Reaver and perhaps my console or the turning wheel early on, I'm going to go for the Assimilator instead, because next turn I'll be able to start flipping my Aesops, which I buried with Apex's ability. One thing I didn't really notice until I started playing this is that Apex's ability actually triggers even on your very first turn, which means that you can start your very first turn with 4 cards after burying something, which I did with the Aesops, and now I bury yet another thing in that will be Aesop's fodder moving forward. I also have just enough money to play that Reaver from my hand, which means that the Aesop's fodder is going to give me a single card as well. Pretty nifty. In the meantime, my opponent is setting up. I no longer have any free servers to run, and sooner rather than later, the Nisei Mark II is going to go into the remote, and hopefully I can contest it by then. It also means that I don't really have access to Apocalypse anymore, since all the servers are ice, barring a nicely timed DDoS. Now I continue drawing, and now my entire hand is filled with Apex cards. This is generally not a good thing, because Apex cards are pretty crappy. I think I've mentioned this before. Anyway, I do find my second Reaver, and this will start accelerating my game, because every single turn I'm gonna get a drip 3 credits and 2 cards at the start of my turn. Imagine if Apex's ability reads, at the start of your turn, gain 3 credits and 2 cards. That's pretty good, isn't it? Well, I'll tell you what's not good. That Informant. Aesops turns out to be a traitor working against the almighty Apex. How could you, Aesops? How could you? This is a clear example of why humans are weak and you should never rely on them. They can be so easily bribed and you can never tell their motives. This is why digital predators are at the apex of the food chain. No pun intended. All I want to see is utter destruction. Speaking of destruction, there's a lot of it in my hand. There's Apocalypse, there's Spray, but I can't make use of any of them because I haven't found my breaker yet, and even if I do, the Armor Qual is not gonna get any virus counters anytime soon. I'm mulling over my Apex trigger here. Which card to bury face down? I don't really want to give up any of the cards in my existing hand, so one really nifty thing you can do is to trigger Aesops before your ID ability. By doing it the other way around, you will get to draw with Reaver, which in my case allowed me to draw into a useless Dirty Laundry, given my opponent iced all the centrals, so I basically just use Apex's ability to bury the Dirty Laundry. Now that's my Aesop's fuel right there, but I need to get rid of the Aesops because of MC Informant. I then also play Hunting Grounds here. To accelerate my game, I decided to use it to dig through the top 3 cards of my stack. Now this is normally not a very useful ability at this stage, but with an installed Assimilator, this is basically Apex's equivalent of a Street Peddler. A pretty crappy equivalent, if I must say, because to install any of the cards drawn off Hunting Grounds, you need to spend double click to flip it up with Assimilator. Fun fact, since I'm talking about Street Peddler here, Street Peddler and Assimilator is apparently a combo. You can use Assimilator to flip up Street Peddler cards, so allowing you to install more than one card off a Street Peddler, which is really interesting, but probably not gonna see much use, given that one of them is a whopping 5 influence mini faction card and the other cannot be installed in Apex. The game goes on, and as you can see, in place of the Informant that was once Aesop's, we now instead have a Chopbot. And this goes to illustrate how powerful it is to have extra consistency by having 6 cards that trigger trashes at the start of your turn rather than 3. If I only played Aesop's in my deck, as was the case in the previous iteration, I wouldn't be able to actually, move forward anymore because my ESOPs is dead. But with the chop bot, I can now start chopping my cards and get insane card draw. This allowed me to then draw my sure gamble, which I then played to get me a good foothold in credits. Now you notice this is turn 7 and I'm still busy setting up. No breakers and yeah, no way to contest my opponent's servers whatsoever. So the Obo Kata was basically free for my opponent. If that had been a Nisei Mark II, I would have been all but out of the game, because Prey and Apocalypse are hard countered by the Nisei Mark II token. Thankfully that wasn't the case, so I'm actually still I can still make something work out of this. But I need to start thinking about how to get my Omaqua counters up and going. That is my number one priority. This is a big problem because I have no idea what the eyes are. I haven't been running. And I could be in a lot of trouble if I hit any nasty ice. The one saving grace is that unlike most other runners, you will basically have infinite, well, almost infinite damage protection. So I'm not that worried about face planting into, say, a Komainu. Or something nasty like a Neuro Katana, because I will be able to deflect those hits with a heartbeat. And here it is the Aiki. So I need to decide to play the side game, and I lose the side game. My opponent actually bid on this one, so now I've overdrawn and it's time to discard to net damage. But I'm gonna just take one net damage and use heartbeat to prevent the other. I try to be conservative with my cards here because there are a couple of cards in my hand that I really want, especially the turning wheel. A very, very curious pull from archives. I found a Nisei Mark II there. I have no idea why. I have no idea what it's doing there because I haven't been building any cards for my opponent. So they must have put it there intentionally. I don't know. That is crazy. One thing though, it did thwart my attempts to get an Omaqua counter, and this is arguably worse than not stealing the Nisei. I actually needed that Omaqua counter really badly. By stealing an agenda on that run, I'm not able to get a turtle counter, so I basically spend the remainder of my turn installing the Cyber Cipher, which allows me to then farm archives by running it repeatedly. So no choice there, because with an extra counter, I maybe could go some other place because I would no longer have to fear certain one strength eyes like Cobra, like Komainu. But now my priority is simply to find any open server that I can break with my existing icebreakers. Alright, so what a game so far. A lot of random twists and turns, but given that my opponent did not ice up archives, I think I'm good to go here. Unfortunately, I still don't have my ESOPs, so I'm relatively poor. Aiki is incredibly taxing for one res cost ice, so I can't be running on that too often. I've decided to bury my Mad Dash here, given that my opponent has revealed their 3-pointer. I don't think Mad Dash is going to come into much play here. The real question is which of these cards I want to chop at this point. And the answer is I'm not going to chop any of them. At this point, the more important thing to do is to preserve my face down cards because I need them to use Prey. Now, this is pretty crazy. I'm using Prey on an Archives Ice. That is unthinkable. Why would you do that? Well, I need to open Archives so that I can farm turtle counters. But doing so also opens up Apocalypse plays, which is why I went for this run. Even though this is not an Archives-based deck, opening Archives doesn't really benefit me much, but I think it was worth it at this juncture, given that Aiki was only res ice on the board, and that I could kill it using Prey. Interesting to note that unlike Cutlery, you don't have to break all subroutines on your target ice in order to kill it. As you saw what I did there, I let the Aiki side game fire, but I still managed to kill it because that was not a requirement to break all subroutines. So I only broke the necessary ones with my Cyber Cipher, and then drop my turning wheel so that I can start asserting central pressure. Alright, my opponent was forced to ice up archives to reactively, but by then I already had the 3 Omaqua counters that I so badly needed, so I'm pretty good to go right here. And with Paperclip in the bin, I can start running more places now. Sentries are not high strength sentries are not something I need to really fear out of Jinteki. You know, you're not worried about Archer or News Hound out of Polana. So I'm pretty good to go for now. My main concern right now is getting more money to break Central Ice, which is why I spent my next turn flipping up Aesops. So now I do have some money to go, but my opponent starts threatening me with an install double advance. That could be a Nisei Mark II, that could be the agenda that brings them up to game point. I need to be really careful. And given their sheer brazenness in advancing that openly, I have to think that they have some really good eyes on that remote. So the question is, do I go for the remote or do I go for the Apocalypse play? Well, I can go for the Apocalypse play by running Centrals first, and if all else fails, run the remote last click. So I'm going to assert Central Pressure here by first running the most difficult server, the Double Ice R&D, which my opponent doesn't really defend. They just show the Komainu, which I easily break. It's going to cost me quite a few credits. I need to take good care of my credit level here, because I need to remain on 3 credits in order to play this, the Apocalypse. I did not have much in the way of heartbeat fodder there. Otherwise, I would have tanked the damage with my heartbeat instead. So, R&D run. Gone through. The next is HQ, obviously. But of course, I got messed up. The R&D run actually lured me into a Cyberdex Virus Suite right top deck on top of R&D. That was brutal. That was really brutal. It reset my Omaqua and prevented me from breaking this ice that I would normally be able to break. So, grasping at strings, I was just going to run HQ and Archives here, but thankfully my opponent did not seem to realize that Apocalypse was a thing. They did not res the HQ ice, and they res their Archives Crick, which meant absolutely nothing. The Crick is not going to do anything when I'm about to Apocalypse you anyway. The Crick is not going to stop me from getting my Apocalypse trigger, so my opponent's Crick does absolutely nothing here. They install another piece of ice on the server, clearly not expecting the Apocalypse coming their way. Who knew an Apex would play Apocalypse? It's infection. Well, board reset, I get all my face down cards and my opponent does not get to score their agenda. This game just got really interesting. My opponent has been reset to square one, but so have I. All my good cards, all my engine pieces, the shopboard, the reavers, everything is now gone. And this is why I keep an Assimilator safe in hand. If you've ever played Apocalypse Shaper before, it's the same concept. You want to hold back at least one copy of your Aesop's Pawn Shop in hand so that you can install it post-Apocalypse, allowing you to sell your face-down cards. In this case, you want to hold the Assimilator back so you can return useful cards back from face-down to face-up. Now, before I go about flipping my cards, there's one thing I want to do here. I run Archives to fetch the agenda my opponent was about to score prior to the Apocalypse, and it turned out to be an Obokata Protocol. I could choose to steal it, but doing so commits my entire hand, meaning both copies of my Assimilators are gone. Don't forget, the third copy is face down. I installed it last time. So if I stole the Obokata there, I would have no way of recovering any of my face down cards. This includes my one-off Cyber Cypher and and my Omaqua as well. So that's a lot of bad news. It allows me to get up to 5 points, but it doesn't give me longevity thereafter. So I did not have a choice. I could not steal the Obokata there, which was a pity, because now my opponent ices Archives and we are back to square one again. I'm not able to fetch the agenda as of yet. So I finally do find the time to install my Assimilator, which then is able to flip up my Aesop's Pawn Shop and get my engine rolling once again. Except that this engine is not as good as before. Even though I can still trigger Aesop's every turn, it does not trigger the face down reavers. And honestly, with so little deck remaining on my side, there's very little point in flipping both of my reavers face up. That would cost me my entire turn. Doesn't seem worth it. And this is where I really begin to realize the flaw of placing Apocalypse in a deck with such an engine. You are destroying a lot of your forward momentum. Imagine if you play Apocalypse in Geist, flipping over your tech traders. That seems like a really bad idea. Same concept here. Even though I'm able to somewhat recover with Wasteland, I think I installed one from hand or something. So I'm getting 4 drip credits a turn, which is nice, and I have a good amount of cards to feed to Aesops. Unfortunately, this is taking way too long. I should be abusing the fact that my opponent had empty servers for a turn or two on ice, but instead, I'm busy setting up my engine, and what this means is that my opponent has now found enough ice to defend the centrals and get the remote going again. That is ridiculous. I can't abuse the opening that Apocalypse offered me, and my opponent, playing a glacial deck, is now well and truly back in the game. So I faceplant an Ike, wanting to farm some more turtle counters, and well, that means I'm losing cards. Seeing that my deck is starting to run out of cards, I'm getting really anxious. Having to suffer damage from this Ike is really going to set me back, especially since I have very limited cards left in my deck, in my hand, and on the table combined. This gives me a limited lifespan remaining, because I still need some of these cards as Aesop's fuel if I want a semi-decent economy engine. Remember that I use my restricted cards not on Aesop's, which means that I do not have the option of playing Levy. So this is something I need, another limitation of the deck that I have to work around, that it will eventually dry up. My resources are going to grind to a halt, and that's a problem. My opponent played best defense on Harbinger, so that was a really interesting interaction. It flipped the Harbinger face down, giving me one less Aesop's trigger on the Harbinger. Not sure if it was worth it or not, considering that triggered Wasteland as well, but I don't know. Anyway, I start to arrive at the bottom of my deck, and even one-turnly use a Deuce's Wild here. The objective here was really to get an exposition, or rather the expose effect, which would give me one more Omaqua counter. I badly needed those Omaqua counters to get past ice. So I expose the HQ ice and I see Cortex Lock, which is obviously a huge problem. That's one ice I cannot afford to run through. But I'm forced to make a run here due to Deuce's Wild secondary effect. So I need to choose my server wisely. I choose the remote here. Maybe there's an upgrade in the server that I can conveniently trash while I'm here. So let's see. It turns out to be Seder Adaptive Barrier. Now this one I actually have an answer to. The paperclip was in the bin, so I get through and see Kelly testing. Interesting deck there. Okay, I'm gonna leave it there. Why? Well, for one, I don't really have to worry about fast advance from my opponent, given what they've shown about their agenda suite so far. What I have to worry about more is never advance, which my opponent does right here. They slap something on the Kelly testing remote and threaten to score a Nisei. If that turns out to be a Nisei, that's theirs. So, pretty dangerous. Maybe I should have trashed it, but the way I thought about it was this. If I didn't have to worry about fast advance, never advance would then be a problem. But not really, because I have DDoS, so I can check this remote, and I can get past this Seder Adaptive Barrier pretty easily. And yeah, by locking the remote this way, by running it every time there's a new card inside, I should be good. So I run it here. The other reason I didn't want to trash the Kelly testing was that I wanted to get my turtle counter. So if I trash any cards during the run, access cards rather, Omaqua doesn't get a counter. I badly needed the Omaqua counter so that I can continue my assault on centrals. Here I continue on my DDoS turn, this time running R&D. Now I'm able to break Ike using Omaqua, so I'm going to play the side game, draw a couple more cards, and what do I see? Best defense. That's irrelevant. My turn ends, and so does the DDoS. It expires, and now we are in a bit of trouble. We are really running low on our deck here, and our opponent is getting good money. The Kelly testing is still a threat, and most importantly, they played optimally. They purged virus counters, thereby wasting my DDoS, and now I have to find a way to get through my opponent's servers once again, this time without Omaqua counters. So yeah, this is why the paperclip is so vital and was a very good addition from Fed's deck. If I were in this situation without a paperclip, my life would be infinitely much harder. If there were Kakugos on scattered around centrals, there would be no way I can get through them, but at least I have a fighting chance here with paperclip. So yeah, you cannot guarantee that you can get through every server. Oh dear, okay, this is a big problem. Vikram 1.0, I didn't see this one coming, and I ran there, third click. With one click remaining, I'm obviously going to dodge one of the brain damage traces. Actually, no. I decided to click through the first subroutine, the one that prevents you from using programs, and then use heartbeat to deflect the other 2 brain damage. I guess that's one subtle benefit of playing Apex. Instead of taking brain damage, you can trash your installed cards instead. This is still not an ideal trade for me, even though I'm able to avoid the brains, which means that I can still steal Obokata. Unfortunately now, I'm really running low on fuel in terms of installed face down cards to feed to Aesops or to use for heartbeat triggers. So I'm running really low here. I just happened to get a very lucky Philotic Snipe off the top of R&D last turn. So thankfully I actually managed to pull through the entire run instead of jacking out halfway by clicking one of the brain damage subs and then jacking out. So very tricky situation we have here. I'm now on 4 points, so an Obokata should win me the game, except that the one in Archives was no longer there. My opponent played a preemptive action and then a genotyping, so all the agendas are in R&D or HQ. I continue flipping over more cards with Assimilator. This time I get my turning wheel out because I badly need to start farming some turning wheel counters if I want to have a chance of winning on centrals. My opponent equally rushes towards their victory by installing a card in server 2, threatening an agenda. So what do I do here? It's pretty tough. I'm out of deck and I have exactly 4 cards in hand. So if I want to have any chance of winning on an Obokata protocol, which is possibly the only agenda in my opponent's deck that is worth 3 points, I need to retain these 4 cards in my hand. So basically, from this point onward, I'm playing as though I am out of cards. The only cards I have access to are those that are already installed on the table. And believe me, there aren't that many. My Armor Core is barely charged up, and I only have the Cipher to work with. Meaning that sentries can't really break them. Which is why every turn from now on, I'm simply going to hammer R&D and click through all the subroutines on Vikram. My opponent continues fortifying R&D with a nasty DNA tracker. Sai makes some good work of it. Unfortunately, my economy engine isn't enough to sustain one R&D run every single turn. 5 credits to break that DNA tracker is still a lot, especially with the Aiki that I have to deal with. But this agenda helps me out quite a bit. A Rogue Chronos project appears on top of R&D, allowing me to get to 5 points, which means that my outs have now expanded. Originally, only the Obokatas remaining would win me the game, but now any Nisei Mark II would also win me the game. So things are looking slightly better, but still, I'm very quickly running out of cards. With no more face-down cards on my board, I begin pawning off irrelevant face-up cards, starting with the Assimilator. This gives me just enough money to break all the ice on R&D without a single penny to spare. I access the top card, and voila, it turns out to be the game-winning Obokata, ending the game with 0 cards in hand and 0 credits to my name. Whew! That's it. We arrive at the same conclusion as the previous successful demo video on Wake Up Call, in that this was a very ideal case scenario where the game was tilted towards my favor. My opponent made the huge blunder of forgetting the in-faction Apocalypse. I got a fairly decent draw with early Aesops, early Double Reaver, and towards the end of the game, R&D held up for me, giving me the Chronos project and then the Obokata in succession. Despite all of that, I was so close to losing, having been grinded out of my deck, having basically no leeway left to steal any remaining Obokatas and so on. It felt like I was playing behind the corp almost every step of the way, with my engine taking so long to assemble and then having to recover, taking longer to recover than my opponent post-apocalypse. So that's the Apex paradox, I would say. With this deck, you find that when you're playing Apocalypse, it actually anti-synergizes with the rest of your deck, because you really don't want to be flipping your cards face down. You set up a nice econ and draw engine, you set up pretty good breakers. Why are they going face down? And you don't have any way to exploit the post-apocalyptic window, you know. Typically decks will have deep data mining, indexing, maybe on-cores, hyperdrivers to make use of that. You don't, because you're Apex, you're not Shaper. And while you do, Assimilator does actually help with the Apocalypse recovery, as we mentioned in the introduction section, I found this game that Assimilator takes way too long to recover from Apocalypse. You need to invest at least, you know, a conservative estimate 6 clicks to get your key cards back. Something like your Aesop's, for example, you need to flip that over, that's 2 clicks. You need your breaker back, that's another 2 clicks. And yeah, maybe your heartbeat, your console against Jinteki. So right there, you need 6 clicks to recover from an Apocalypse. That's way too much time. And if you choose not to play Apocalypse in such a deck, instead opting to build a solid engine and a solid breaker suite, well, isn't Geist just better? Because at the end of the day, Apocalypse and all the ice destruction, all the asset destruction is half the reason you play Apex. The flavor is all about wanton destruction and devouring the entire world. You know, playing with just Reavers, Wastelands, and Aesop seems contrary to that. So I don't know. To me, it seems both like a flavor fail and you know, from a gameplay perspective, a strategic fail as well, because you're just better off with Geist. Well, if there's one thing we can say, is that Apex, even after receiving the new card in Assimilator, is still trash. Thanks for watching and happy net running. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.